Prop 5.
Good evening. So, like the state, local governments are required to get voter approval in order to issue general obligation bonds. Proposition 5 would change the voter threshold for general obligation bonds that would support housing or public infrastructure. Specifically, the measure would change that voter threshold from a 2/3 approval requirement to a 55% voter approval requirement. So the measure itself is not approving any bonds. It is simply changing the threshold by which local governments have to get the approval of their local voters in order to do so. It also applies to any measures that are on this November ballot, if it were to be approved. In looking at the fiscal effects of this measure, we looked at a number of recent elections and found that roughly 20 to 50% of additional bond measures, depending on the election, would have otherwise passed with this lower threshold. Those measures would have raised a couple of $2 billion across the state. So were this measure to pass, we would anticipate seeing more local bond measures for public infrastructure and housing to pass that would result in increased borrowing to support those activities. And those bonds, the repayment of those bonds, are paid with higher property taxes.
Okay, great. The state legislature put this one on the ballot. The support comes from the Democratic Party, California State Building and Trades Council, AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which will be a recurrent theme in a bunch of these, California Yes in My Backyard, California Labor Federation, League of Women Voters, and the United Way Bay Area. And then opposition, we have the California Chamber of Commerce, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association again, National Federation of Independent Businesses, California Republican Party is against, and then Catalyst for Local Control. The LA Times and Sacramento Bee came out in favor of this, and then these other newspapers across the state, including the San Francisco Chronicle and the Southern California News Group, East Bay Times, and San Diego Union Tribune, all against. So the money on this one, in support, we have about $5 million coming from the Zuckerbergs, each of them giving $2.5 million. And then in opposition, we have realtor organizations for the most part, and the California Business Roundtable, but organizations that probably make sense for the purposes of this initiative. But there's a lot more money against this, so you may see more advertising on the no side than you do on the yes side on this measure. What questions do you have?
Okay, so one of my biggest questions, because this has been one of those where to raise taxes is always that 2/3. And then with schools, in order for them to raise bonds for their infrastructure, they went and they had to get it changed so that it could drop to 55%. So it sounds like we're kind of chipping away at this 2/3. Not that I'm in a disagreement. I think that it needs to be changed because it seems like this is only for housing, correct? It's very narrow, and it's like we have to go back to the ballot each time to get this threshold from 2/3 down to something more reasonable, or 55%. So do I have that understanding correct?
Mostly, yes. So it is correct that the Constitution states that in order for local governments to issue general obligation bonds, they have to get voter approval. And under, I believe it was Proposition 13, that level was set at 2/3. In 2000, Proposition 39 changed that threshold for school bonds only to be 55%. And so this measure does parallel Proposition 39 to change that voter requirement, but for housing as well as public infrastructure. So that could include roads, water projects, utilities, a pretty wide variety of local capital projects. So it is, it does apply to a large component of what general obligation bonds typically are issued for by local governments.
Is there any chance that, maybe this is anathema to most people, almost a repeal of that Prop 13, because setting that 2/3 threshold is so high and it makes it so difficult to get things that we really need in general, just to try and get the housing. And even Prop 13 obviously is not a solution for everything, because you have some property owners, mostly commercial, that don't have to increase their property taxes except by 2%, but yet you have residential who are seeing these prices go crazy because we don't live as long as many corporations.
So you're referencing the cap on property taxes instituted by Proposition 13. That is not addressed in this particular ballot measure. It did go to the voters in some components in 2020, but it did not pass.
Fun fact, Prop 13 imposed a two-thirds requirement, but it did not pass by a full two-thirds itself.